Hi, I'm Doug Pardue. The scary thing is that our project is really very similar to Miami's project, but instead of young innocent children being brutalized, we have women being brutalized in the privacy of their own home, and there's no agency designed to watch out for them, even if the agency down there didn't do such a good job. Unfortunately, the women who suffered in South Carolina had no place to turn. They would often be brutalized over the course of their lifetime. Most of them would be beaten, stabbed. We had one thrown down a well, one chopped up, put in a barrel, and floated down the stream until someone found the body. It's amazing what loved ones do to other loved ones, and it's just really weird to have these two at the opposite ends of the same table. When I first went to South Carolina, I was hired by a managing editor at the state paper named Paula Ellis, and she told me to come to the state that's at the top of every list you want to be at the bottom of, and at the bottom of every list you want to be at the top of. It's a great place for investigative reporting. And she was indeed right about that. Unfortunately, it was all too easy to find flaws in South Carolina. And to some extent, you start to get a little numb to the being at the top of every list and being at the bottom of every list. And the sad thing about our series, and the sad thing that troubles me today, is all of the hundreds of women who suffered because no one had turned a light to the problem that they've been suffering for years. We didn't launch this project until late September 2013, when the Violence Policy Council, a group in D.C. which has been ranking the rate at which women are killed by men across the nation, rated South Carolina the #1 state in the nation in the rate of women killed by men, a rate more than double the national average. We decided that we should take a look at this, and I joined up with Glenn Smith, a fellow project reporter, project editor now, and he decided, well, he was going to call up because the Violence Policy Council, in cooperation with experts in South Carolina, were going to have a call-in press conference for all the media in South Carolina. So Glenn calls in, and I don't know, all of you probably called him. You have that little beep when you answer the phone on a conference call. Well, he beeped in, and they sat there and waited for other people to beep in, and they waited, and they waited. And we were the only media in South Carolina to call in to find out what was going on to cause South Carolina to be the #1 state in the nation in the rate of women killed by men. So Glenn and I said, you know, this might be a story. And we decided we better take a harder look at it than just a daily story or a weekender about it. And we started trying to put together a database of all the people who had been killed in domestic violence going back 10 years. And that became a real labor because South Carolina, unlike most states, doesn't do a very good job of keeping its records. It's kind of like your housing records. You run into a lot of silverfish in our profession. And so we had to go literally from county to county to dig up court records. We put together a large database that basically told us about everyone who was killed, told us about all of the killers. We checked all of the cases to see what had happened to them, how many plea deals were worked out. We found cases in which a man could be convicted of first-time criminal domestic violence 7 times before he finally killed his wife. 7 times. And that was not unusual. 1/3 of all of the killers of women had been convicted at least once before, and 2/3 of them had been convicted multiple times of violence. Something was definitely wrong with this system, and something was definitely wrong with the state of South Carolina that could allow this to go on for so long. We soon recruited Jennifer to join us because Jennifer at the time was our faith and values reporter. And we had the sense that there was a component in this story that we needed to understand. And I tend to be a little too dry to understand that sort of stuff, and I think Jennifer could definitely dig in and figure out what was going on. So Jennifer and I went on our first interview, and in that interview we were talking to the head of a women's shelter, and we were asking her, turned to her and said, so just what is it about South Carolina that causes us to be the #1 state in the nation in the rate of women killed by men? And she started rattling off all the reasons. She says poverty, isolation, traditional Southern attitudes, ruralism, gun culture. And then she stops and she says, and then there's that religion thing. Jennifer and I look at each other. And we go, what? And she says, till death do us part. First time I've ever done a project where we knew the title before we really done any reporting. But we realized then, too, that getting at the culture, finding out not just the numbers, not just how the political system, not just how the court system was failing women, we had to learn what was wrong with South Carolina that tolerated this level of violence. And that's what Jennifer is going to talk to you about.
Well, I would say it made a lot of sense when Jonathan said you have something that's sitting in plain sight right in front of you. And in South Carolina, I don't think it would be a surprise to anybody here that it's a pretty patriarchal state. None of us is from South Carolina who worked on this project. So we went into it really trying to think, how could we be sensitive to the people who live in this state and who hold things like their marital vows very sacred? You know, South Carolina is obviously a very Christian state. It's a very conservative state. And the idea that you would cling to your wedding vows very tightly, I think most of us would agree is probably a good thing, right? But when we started talking with women, we heard over and over again about how they would go to their pastors, for instance, and they would be counseled to stay in their marriage, to try to work it out. Often spouses would come in together to receive counseling and then go home together. You can kind of think where this would go if you're going home together and now the husband is pissed that he's been called to the mat by the pastor. So we set out looking a little bit at what is the state of women in South Carolina. We have a female governor, believe it or not, our first one. But when we looked in the South Carolina Senate, for instance, there's only one woman in the entire South Carolina Senate out of 70-some-odd senators, and only a handful in the House. So when you're looking at passing domestic violence reform, who's voting on it? That's not to say every man is going to be callous to domestic violence, but there was no woman really taking the leadership role. So we looked at that, and then also we went and talked to a number of pastors, and we're really interested to find out that most of them had very little idea how to counsel a woman who was in this position. I think a lot of them were torn. The other piece of it that I thought was very interesting was we heard over and over again, there was a former legislator who at one point in time had stood up and said that it was really the fault of the women who stay in these relationships, that they, in a sense, they were to blame. If it was so awful, why didn't they get out? And this is a state legislator who had been on the school board making this point. So we set out and wrote an entire story looking at just why do women stay in these relationships, whether it's for finances, whether it's, a lot of them, let me back up, a lot of them are women who didn't work. Going back to the traditional roles that are very prevalent in South Carolina, a lot of these women didn't work, so they were financially trapped in relationships. Other ones were, we tried to really get into the idea of a woman who feels absolutely no self-confidence in her marriage or her relationship and would stay because she doesn't believe anybody else would want her, or who stays because she's just afraid. One thing that we found that was really interesting was that the time when a woman is in the most danger is when she leaves. So how do you counsel a woman to leave this relationship knowing she's going to be in the most danger? And so this we really tried to look at the nuances of our state's culture without really coming across as judgmental, because, like I said, none of us are from South Carolina, but trying to point out ways that patriarchal nature was trapping these women.
The data gave us specificity, but it was the victims, the women, the children who survived these cases that gave us the power. So by telling their stories, we were able to show the drama, the human tragedy, the human toll that domestic violence took on our citizens. And but the data gave us the ability to be ironclad and say, And it's not just an anecdote that we pulled out of nowhere. This is true across the state.
So our story is really the fruit of this 5-year campaign by the Journal to undo this strange opacity in the Medicare program that stretched back decades. So I think I should start with a little bit of that history. Back in the mid-1970s, some technocrats in the Medicare program thought it would be a good idea if they made payments to hospitals and ultimately doctors more transparent. They wanted to publish basically how much they were paying each of these institutions or medical providers so people could understand what was going on in the program as it grew. The doctors didn't like that idea very much, and they sought and won an injunction to block Medicare from releasing physician-specific data about their payments in 1979. So flash forward about 30 years, the Journal, and this was an effort as much by our legal team as our reporters, decided that this was not sort of a great public policy position and intervened in that lawsuit from the doctor's injunction against releasing the data successfully. Back in the day, the doctors had argued that releasing such payment data would be sort of an unwarranted invasion of their privacy. They didn't want people looking into their wallets. The judge said enough had changed since then. Basically, the program grew to be so huge and so expensive that the interest in revealing more of that data seemed to outweigh the privacy issue. That case, for us, ended in 2013 when the injunction was overturned. And then last year, after this long legal effort, the Medicare agency finally published data that would show what doctors got paid for doing to how many patients, essentially. It's not perfect. It's only 1 year, but it gives us more insight, I think, than we've probably ever been able to obtain into this sort of the intersection of these Byzantine rules and financial incentives in Medicare to do sometimes very strange treatments. The individual providers and sort of case studies that came out of our analysis of this data probably stretch across the spectrum from essentially outright fraud to more systemic problems. The program pays doctors to do more services, not less. Sometimes it pays them more to favor certain types of treatments or drugs or tests. And in culling through the data, we were able to find some pretty, I think, compelling examples of that show both why the program costs taxpayers so much, and also some of the ways that it probably shapes the treatment seniors and disabled people in the country receive. It's one of the challenges is that with the limits of the data, it could be very difficult to go from a story that, from the idea that you can see that this one doctor is using way more of some drug or doing way more of some test, to really understanding why it is that they're choosing to perform medicine in such a manner. And that's where a lot of shoe leather reporting came in with each of these stories that we did. One example that I really enjoyed was a story on doing drug tests for things like PCP and cocaine on seniors that's sort of blossomed into this really lucrative business out of almost nowhere about 4 or 5 years ago. The reason it's exploded is not that seniors are using ecstasy and club drugs at higher rates. It's that it's basically that the way Medicare pays doctors for doing urine drug tests encourages them to do as many tests as possible. And when they give people opioids, they want to make sure that they're A, taking them, and B, not taking other drugs that might indicate substance abuse. That's been a huge problem with a rising toll of deaths in recent years. And it made sense, I think, to a lot of medical experts to encourage more such testing. But the rules for paying doctors for this mean that you want to stack. If you're going to do the tests at all, you want to stack as many different drugs into that bundle as you can. Because you get paid an extra $20, $25, $30 depending on the test for each one. And that's helped. That dynamic had helped move this thing from like a $30 million a year in terms of Medicare payments suite of services to basically a $500 million a year industry just of doctors testing Medicare patients for the drugs. And the data could really help us understand who's driving those dynamics, what the doctors are doing to sort of maximize their ability to extract money from this program, and in that particular case, to guide the treatment that just hundreds of thousands of pain patients around the country are receiving. On the other end of the spectrum, we had this great story that I want to ask for Stewart to talk a little bit about, where this guy, what was the treatment called? This guy in Los Angeles was using this very medieval sounding heart treatment that involves like cuffs on people's arms. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that one.
So we did this story about outliers in the data, where we looked at specific doctors that were using whose practices were based on a large amount of their practice based on one particular procedure. And this one procedure that we came across is called external counterpulsation, which is EECP, and that it is somewhat medieval in the sense that you get to your heart, and particularly this is something called extreme angina, real chest pain. So the patient is put on a table and literally strapped down, and they're strapped down, and they have these inflatable cuffs that inflate, and lie there for an hour, and it's a very rare procedure. Most cardiologists they'll do some sort of intervention, surgery to loosen up the.
How many times did the Cleveland Clinic do it?
The Cleveland Clinic did this procedure like 6 times, half a dozen times, half a dozen patients in 1 year. This particular doctor was doing it. 95% of his Los Angeles business was this procedure, and he's doing it dozens and dozens of times. So he literally created this factory around this very, very rare procedure. He was making over $2 million in 1 year on this procedure. So just the ability, the data showed this very unusual thing. I think only 200, just over 200 other doctors actually even used this procedure in all of the data. So we went in, documented what was going on there, and found this basically factory where they were bringing people in from the community. They were treating it more. It had become more of a way to not necessarily a treatment for angina, but a way for these people just to sort of get off the street and relax. And that we spoke to said that she liked to go there because she'd go to sleep. And they had music going on and everything. So we were able to document that pretty intimately, and it was one of the most big.
I mean, it's an amazing case study in how easy it is to extract money from the program, right?
And they had gone on to open up another a satellite ship of this clinic in the Beverly Hills area. So they were moving into that area as we were looking into it.
So I think in terms of the harm and the impact of this kind of work, it's clear that some of the behaviors that these stories are exploring are costing the taxpayers lots of money. Medicare is a giant economic issue. Costs for healthcare have been growing more slowly in recent years, but I think economists generally agree that's going to change again, and it needs to be addressed long term. Separately, this area that we're getting into more and more now is that the rules for how Medicare pays for stuff, we're finding it can shape pretty important decisions about patients' treatment, where money more than medical wisdom seems to guide decisions. And we're continuing this work into this year. Now we're using some different data that covers hospital claims to explore similar patterns in their billing. And one thing we did just in the last couple of weeks was show how a certain kind of hospital, these facilities called long-term care hospitals, discharge patients based on the very day of their length of stay when Medicare pays the most, right? So they might get $20,000 if they discharge somebody on day 22 and $35,000 if they wait another day. And to make sure that happens, people who work for these companies explained in great detail that they'll do things like extend courses of antibiotics, or add new therapy regimens that maybe patients don't necessarily need to keep them in the bed for an extra day or two to make that money. That carries some risk. You can get hospital-acquired infections if you sit around in a hospital that you don't need to be in. And on the other end of it, it means that they might be, in some cases, discharging people who really aren't ready to leave to hit that sweet spot. And I think there's a lot more to be done by us and others in this area. But we're very pleased we were able to make at least some of this data more transparent. I don't know how we would have ever executed any of these stories as we did without access to this type of data. I think we could have made a strong case that Medicare pays doctors in sometimes Byzantine ways, but it would have been, I think, probably implausible to show that any given actor, was behaving in a certain way that put money ahead of patients without being able to have this essentially irrefutable track record of all that they've done.